The first thing I'd like to say is I can't imagine having three people on stage with whom I would rather have this discussion. So, it's always vital to take a moment and when you're wandering about and to notice when impossible things are happening. And so this is definitely one of them. So I'm very happy to have you here and very much looking forward to this discussion. And so I thought I would start with, I prepared a couple of questions that I shared with the panel beforehand, and then we'll move into the questions that you're all submitting on the app. One of the things I think that distinguishes this conference, possibly, from others that are arguably like it is its emphasis on the story. And I guess I'd like to start, Oz, let's start with you. There's a difference between a story and a theory. There's a difference between a story and a set of scientific facts. How do you understand the relationship between the story that we've been so emphatic about in the opening of this conference? How do you conceptualize a story? And I guess, so that's the question, is what's your theory of stories and why do you think they're so important?
Well, facts and experiences are never neutral. They're always within a framework, and the most powerful framework is a story that is true, and particularly if it's history. And that's what many people lack today. So we think of history as something you Google a few facts and so on, but people don't have a sense of identity because they don't have the purpose and the meaning which comes from being part of a great story in which we're fulfilling our small role now. So stories are essential.
Right, so a story is a way of organizing value judgments, and it's a way of uniting people socially, uniting people psychologically. Is that
telling us where we've come from, telling us where we are now, and what are the choices ahead if we want to make the best of the future.
Ayaan, maybe to flesh that out a little bit, I would say you've lived within the confines of a variety of stories, and so let's expound on that a little bit. Tell me your theory of story, and maybe you could reflect a little bit, if you would, on what different stories you've inhabited and what the consequences of that have been for you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just start by saying a story is also the moment, and it's a moment when you're forced to make choices. So in my background, I obviously was raised with the story that gave meaning to my parents and my grandparents over generations. But what was always clear was that you always had God on your side. There was the story we were told was the story of this is God's purpose for you, for all of us. The answers were a given. I became dissatisfied with that story, I think as most people here know. And I picked a different story when I was old enough, I thought, and capable enough to make a choice. And again, I think we find ourselves today, right now, in a moment where we have to make a choice, and we have to make a moral choice. I sit here and I can say today, given what's going on, I support Israel. No buts, no ifs, unequivocally. That is a moral choice. And it is based on the story of the civilization that I adopted. And the civilization that I adopted, Western civilization, is threatened with a story from the civilization that I left. And I think for me, these are the two stories of my time. And there are times when I feel depressed and think, why on earth do I have to be, why do I have to deal with this? But there are times like now when I really feel strengthened and emboldened and say, I have children and I'm fighting for the civilization that I adopted for my children and for your children. And we have to fight. And it makes me extremely optimistic that this room today is full of people who see that and who want to fight back. That's the story.
What do you think in your own life, what do you think the differences are between the times when you're feeling more despair, let's say, and more hopelessness, and the times that you're feeling more optimistic?
The hopelessness for me comes when people make excuses for evil. When you have 3 weekends in a row, 100,000 people who live here and who've grown up here and who enjoy the blessings of this civilization march in London and make excuses for evil and side with evil. It makes me despair because the rest of us don't stand up to it. But it also gives me hope to come here and say, let's stand up for it. Because now we know what evil looks like and we know exactly what we're facing. It's not only the Jewish babies that they're beheading. They will behead your babies, Jewish or not, if you don't fit into their story.
Okay, I have one more question for you on that side of things. Now, you grew up in one story, within the confines of one story, let's say, and you said that there was a time in your life where you chose another. And I would say, what do you think, why did you make the decision that you did make to value the latter story, the Western story that you identified with? Why did you make that decision? And how do you justify it?
It was very easy to make the decision because it's a Western story, and Western civilization is a story that cherishes life, that goes to great lengths to preserve life. The story I left was a story that cherishes death. My life as a woman meant nothing. I was a thing, to be traded, to be used, and then to be discarded. And once I found out the differences, I adopted this story that is all about the preservation of life, not only for people in the West, but all human life. That's the story of the West. That's the story that's not told.
So, John, Ayaan has made the claim that she found or interpreted the story that has been playing out in the West as something that was life-affirming for her as an individual, and perhaps even more specifically as a woman. And she's pointing to the life-affirming element of the foundational elements of Western civilization, and I suppose part of that would be the insistence that each person, man and woman alike, are made in the image of God and of intrinsic worth, and that is something that we practice, at least to some degree, as well as preach. Now, one of the things that you and I have talked about is that despite the, let's say, the life-affirming element of that story, people have lost faith in it, and there's a certain amount of desperation that's associated with that. And so I would say, well, what have you seen in relationship to that desperation, and why do you think the desperation itself is misplaced?
Well, I think it is essentially because we do not tell our own story anymore, and it's left us in a state of confusion. My father was involved in another civilisational moment. He was with the famous 9th Division in the Australian Army, North African desert. He was given up for dead by the medicos, but made it through the night, and I'm here to tell that story. He wouldn't talk of the horrors of war, but I grew up knowing that a massive thing had happened and that my father had gone to his station. He'd stepped up. He'd done what he could. He used to tell a lighter story. Stories are so powerful. 2 Aussie diggers, servicemen for those of you who are not Australian, but most of you are, so... finding their way to a bit of leave, and they dock in Plymouth, and being Australians, just relieved to be alive. They head deep into the city, they find a pub, they get themselves written off. At 10 o'clock, they're thrown out on the street. It's closing time, and Bert looks at Wally and says, mate, we got a problem. We don't know where we are. And Wally says, this bloke walking down the street, he'll be able to help us. And it's an admiral of the British fleet. And he's covered in gold braid and medals. Hey, mate, we're lost. Where are we? I say, do you chaps know who I am? And one Australian looks at the other and says, and now we're in real trouble. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is. And that's our culture today. We don't know where we've come from.
Yeah.
We don't know where we are. We don't know how to find our way back to the ship. And we heard that marvellous quote from Churchill this morning. He made the point that when we don't pass on our children, we leave our stories to our children. The story, he said, of our beliefs and our heroes, we leave them without a sense of purpose and place and direction. And, this is the answer to the question, open to Karl Marx's dictum that a people who do not know their history are open to persuasion. Well, where have we left our young people today without a story? Believing they can be an island. The tragedy of the aggressive pursuit of secularism side by side with the aggressive pursuit of individualism, to the point where the great virtue today is personal autonomy. Each man is an island, but we're not up to the task of being God over our own lives and living in isolation. It doesn't work. And the personal harvest is bitter. We see that in the numbers. You see that in your profession. Loneliness, anxiety, mental health, self-harm amongst our young people in a country like Australia and yours. I mean, this is unbelievable. But the collective harvest is bitter as well. Identity politics, atomisation, the lack of community, and individualism should never be a selfish doctrine. But we haven't told the story. We've not passed it on. We've not brought the wisdom of the ages to the current generation. And if nothing else motivates every one of us in this room, it ought to be that current generation, our children and our grandchildren.
So let me... So I'll address this question to all three of you. You can jump in when you see fit. So Ayaan, the people who are protesting that you were objecting to, one way of interpreting that, let's say, is that they live within the confines of a counter-narrative that's developed in the last 150 years. Oz, you made reference to this in your video, that the appropriate lens through which to view human social organization and history is one of power. It's a Marxist variant. The Marxists would have started with and ended with economic power, and the poly-Marxists that we have now seem to view everything in that light. Many of the people who are protesting the Palestinian cause would say that they're standing up for the victims against the oppressed, and of course history is a complicated nightmare. And this counter-narrative of victimization and oppression has spread like mad. It's essentially unquestionable doctrine in the universities in large part. All three of you have made reference to the fact that we should take some pride in our history and on our traditional stories. We should know our history and the narratives that have guided and united us. But the opponents of that viewpoint would point to the atrocities, the undeniable atrocities of history. They would point to the power dynamics that permeate society and the past, and they would say, we have no reason to put faith in what we've managed because it's fundamentally been a manifestation of power and oppression. And so, and you know, history, what did James Joyce say? History is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken, right? There's something to that. And so Oz, when you're not a naive man, none of the people up here are naive, I don't believe. When you look at the counter-narrative that insists upon the brute reality of power as let's say, the ultimate mediator between people and the catastrophes that's emerged as a consequence of that, how can you simultaneously say that we should have some, let's say, pride in our heritage and in our stories and in what's united us previously? How do you reconcile those in your own imagination?
You know, Rabbi Sachs used to say that the central choice today is between the idea of power and the power of ideas. But of course, which ideas? Now, for me, the radical left tackles injustice, and they're right to do so. There is injustice. But the difference is they have no truth. Postmodernism, we're post-truth. If there's no truth, everything's power. So you set up a conflict of powers to subvert the status quo. And the Romans are very clear about the end result of this. You can only achieve the peace of despotism. In other words, a power so powerful, it puts down every other power, the state. So I would say bluntly about the radical left, their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and their promised futures never arrive. Now you compare that with the Jewish and Christian understanding. Say the Hebrew prophets, you address truth to power and call for an about-turn of heart and mind. And the freedom to go wrong is also the freedom to say, I was wrong, I need to change. And forgiveness is built on freedom. You can have the past freed and the future of a second chance freed. And the prophetic biblical understanding, Jewish and Christian, with that strong sense of freedom and responsibility, bringing truth to power. Yes, we're both tackling injustice, but you come out in very, very different directions. As the rabbis say, what is a hero? Someone who conquers? No. Someone who can turn an enemy into a friend. Truth to power through repentance, reconciliation, forgiveness.
Okay, so you set up a metaphysics where there is some other truth than power. And so I'm going to ask Ayaan. So you spent a lot of your life dealing with manifestations of brute power, and you've had plenty of time to consider the difference, let's say, between power and truth. And that's a very tricky difference. Like, it's easy to point to power, and it's easy to point to the role that it plays in most social relationships and social organizations. It's easy to point to the role it's played historically. It's not so easy to formulate the truth that's the alternative to power. And so I would ask you, Ayaan, like, how do you now, we haven't spoken for years, how do you now conceptualize the difference between, let's say, the truth that Oz is pointing to and power itself? And why do you think that's an important difference?
So I think that I agree absolutely with everything you said. I think power is a given. It's like the law of gravity, and there's also powerlessness, and none of us want to be powerless. But there is God-given natural power. What is, within Western civilization, there have been these two positions on how you view power. And on one side, there is a worldview that sees the human being as a construct, the truth as a construct. People are not bad. They do bad things because society made them do it. And if we had the power to reconstruct and to modify and to manipulate, we could then, because we could create this human being who is going to be perfect. A very leftist way of looking at things. A different way of looking at it is you accept nature, you accept human beings as they are, and you deal with issues like power. And again, this is another Western civilizational construct, which is power is checked. No one can presume to be all-powerful. And it's very arrogant to assume that you can change human beings to fit into all sorts of modules. Therefore, you accept that there is a power transcendent above us. And that idea that there is something above us, a higher power, I think that is rooted in Christianity, it's rooted in the Judeo-Christian traditions, and in many ways, it is superior to the nihilistic Nietzsche-type atheistic theology that human beings can do, and they can create everything, and they can manipulate. And it's also superior, I would say, to the faith that I grew up in, with a God and a theology and a story that gives individuals a sort of one-dimensional purpose, go and do this, make everyone a Muslim, and if they refuse, kill them, and then the day of judgment will come and life will be over. That's a simple story, but it's an abiding story. It's been around for 1400 years. The Judeo-Christian tradition, that it is not up to the human being to do that, but all we can do is civilize and continue to civilize and question and check power. Power that is checked, that is the power that guarantees most people real freedom.
Okay, so let me sum, and then I'll turn to you. So maybe one of the ways of getting to the gist of what has been said so far, although perhaps not the only way, is that there's a viewpoint that says that power is what is the ultimate manifestation, and truth by necessity serves power. And I think that that's not a bad summary of the alliance between postmodernism and Marxism. It's the brute reality is power, and everyone's truth claims serve their power claims regardless of what they're actually saying. So it's power uber alles, let's say. Okay, so the counterclaim is something like whatever that true power, we can reverse it. True power is that which serves truth rather than truth serving power. We can invert it. True power is that which serves truth, which posits that there's a truth beyond power, and you pointed that to some degree in two ways. You said some of that emerges as a consequence of the balance between competing power claims, and some of it is also a consequence of the supposition that we are all beholden to something that's transcendent and above us, and that it's necessary that we are. And so now, John, you've thought about these sorts of things very deeply, and from what I understand about you in our conversations and in our personal relationship is that you have strived to what would you say? You've strived with the power that's been granted to you to serve truth. How do you think that's different than merely manifesting your own power? And why do you believe your own claim that you're trying to serve something like truth rather than power? You know, because if I was a really suspicious Marxist type, I would say, your claim that you're serving something other than power is just an index of how tricky and Machiavellian you really are, right? Yeah.
I was hoping you wouldn't expose me. Look, life is a tricky business. Politics is a tricky business. Now, one of the most, to me, attractive things about a true conservative is they understand this great essential, which is that human nature does not change.
Yes.
And it's the loss of that wisdom that I think has led to this sort of dog-eat-dog society now. We cannot hold properly in suspension the idea that Blaise Pascal, the great French mathematician and thinker, who made that very, I think, a remarkable comment, that man is both the glory and the scum of the universe. Or as Solzhenitsyn had it, the dividing line between good and evil passes not between man and woman or black and white or Catholic or Baptist or Muslim or Christian, but somewhere across every human heart. And the point that I would draw out of that I think is worth making is, and you know, I owe a lot of this thinking to Oz because you've had a touch of his thinking, but I'm going to unashamedly plug his writings, The Magna Carta of Humanity and the short version, The Civilizational Moment. It'll get you thinking. Seriously, Oz's writings, I've been enjoying them since I was 25. But it's really important to understand that at the high points, wise men and women have been afraid of power. They've not wanted to pursue it for themselves to lord it over others. The American founding fathers realised that the road to freedom wasn't, this may come as a surprise to some, not to think of the American people as exceptional and as great and as awesome and what have you, but to recognise with all their resources and so forth, power might go to their heads. Mob rule might take over. The road to freedom is through realism. It's the point Ayaan has made. You divide power up. You limit it. Nobody can accumulate too much of it for too long. You ensure that governments can be changed when they get lazy and sloppy. Mind you, there was a government in Australia that didn't get lazy and sloppy once, and they still voted us out. But they do, and you can change them at the point of a pencil. And yeah, all of us have things in our own cultures that we're ashamed of that have been messy and unattractive. But the lesson of history is that some have been infinitely better than others, and some have been infinitely more horrible. And when it's been about the pursuit of power and lording it over others, rather than a commitment to the common good and to human flourishing and the service of others, I mean, good grief, I don't know how they measure these things, but 4 million, half the world's population, one way or another, tapped into Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. They were acknowledging a remarkable woman, but what was she most remarkable for? Her dedication to her subjects, to other people. Goodness does happen. You just need to temper it with great realism and avoid utopianism.
Okay, so one of the mysteries, I think, about the claim that power is the ultimate motivational principle from a psychological perspective is that I'm always left wondering, like, power in relation to what? So you might say, well, if I'm powerful, I can have what I want, but it begs the question when you phrase it that way. If you say I'm powerful, I can get what I want, the question it begs is, well, what's the nature of my wants? And why do I think those wants are the I that should be served, right? Because if you look at people who are narcissistic, for example, or psychopathic, who do rely on nothing but power to get their way, that power is always in the service of a very finite and selfish, impulsive hedonism. And the problem with that is that immediate gratification is not only rather pointless, but also destructive of any long-term relationships. You know, if I use you or anyone else as merely a vehicle for my immediate gratification, I forgo any sort of relationship that we might have that would be productive over any length of time. The other thing you see that happens to people who only use power is that they betray themselves. I mean, many people who are psychopathic users of power end up in prison because they do stupid short-term things that compromise their medium to long-term well-being. And so, Oz, maybe we'll start with you. It's like part of what I see as the relationship between this transcendent good that we've been describing, that's often characterized as God, let's say, is that it's the antithesis of that impulsive and hedonistic selfishness that, if manifested, is by necessity psychologically and socially destructive. So I'm wondering, like, is that a way of conceptualizing the relationship between the immediate and the transcendent that you would accept? Or
change it from a power discussion to freedom discussion, which is where it touches most people in the West. And Lord Acton famously, freedom is not the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought. Because real freedom is like a gift in sports or music or whatever. Dedication and discipline, and you grow free, but you're not instinctively free. Whereas many of our Western views of freedom are unrealistic, libertarianism and so on, freedom from.
Right.
And we need to recast the whole understanding of freedom.
Right, so that's how freedom deteriorates into hedonism.
That's right.
Now, well, one of the things we
Let me put it simply.
Yep.
Freedom absolutized is anarchy. Reason absolutized is authoritarianism. So you look at the two false revolutions, say in the Russian Revolution 1917, you had both the anarchists and the Marxists against the Tsar, and they won. But then, of course, the Marxists, red power, ate up the anarchists, the black power, because unbridled freedom is, in the long run, unrealistic, and you will always end up with power.
Right.
And so we've got to reinsert a robust, realistic, as you'd say, responsible view of freedom again. The central issue in the West is freedom. If we can get that right, everything else flows in its wake.
Okay, so I'll make a quick comment and then turn to you too. So I sat and did a seminar on Exodus with Oz and a variety of other people, and one of the things that we were struck by in the Exodus story is that when God commands Moses to oppose the Pharaoh, so to free the slaves and to stand against tyranny, that's how to think about it archetypally. How do you free yourself if you're a slave? And from your slavish habits, how do you free other people if they're enslaved or oppressed? How do you stand against tyranny? What God told Moses to say to the Pharaoh was, let my people go. which is, of course, a famous civil rights cry, but that isn't what is said. What's said is, let my people go so they may worship me in the desert. And that's a very different view, because it's a view of ordered freedom, right? And it's the freedom that you're describing about, that's freedom to make your responsibility manifest rather than the freedom to chase your hedonistic whim.
Exactly.
Right, right.
Now, the alternative Hebrew is not just worship, but serve. And you think of the Bob Dylan line, you've got to serve somebody.
Yeah.
And people who think they're totally free are really the most slaves
Right,
in the end.
right. Well, that's because they serve their whims, as far as I can tell. Ayaan?
Yeah, I think that in the West, we made this mistake of having a debate about is there a God? Is there a God? And then having everybody weigh in and twisting ourselves into pretzels. There is no God, there is a God, which is, I think, and I've come to realize over time, that is a waste of time. It's not in the least helpful. I think what we should have done instead, what we should do instead, is compare the different concepts of God that humanity has come up with, and the different stories that humans have told each other about that what is transcendent. And what I find appealing, for instance, about the Judeo-Christian story is that that transcendent power ends up being a story about freedom, about tempering power, about establishing institutions and establishing teachings that give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, that don't matter, basic, maybe universal human decency then becomes that's your religious, that's how you worship your transcendent. That story is superior to a number of other stories that I know. And I think that's the story we should be having. And if you have that story, and if you have that legacy, you've inherited that, then you not only appreciate it, but you also fight to preserve it. And you have a mirror to hold to the other gods that are presenting themselves as omnipotent and powerful.
So you put your finger on something key there, I think, because I think one of the things that happened in the West after the Enlightenment is that we started to regard the religious proposition as one theory about how the world was as a set of facts among others. And so you can have the conversation, is there a God or isn't there a God, as if that's a simple statement of fact. But the point you're making...
And you can have it without losing your head.
Right. And the point you're making, the point Oz was making, I think is something like, well, you're going to be in service to something, and you could be in service to you could be subordinate to your impulsive and hedonistic whims, or you could integrate that in a manner that puts you in service to something that's higher, and then the question becomes, as you point out, well, what is the core nature of that which is highest? We'll accept as a proposition that there's a rank ordering of values from lowest to highest. The question becomes, what's appropriately put at the highest? And you're pointing to such limitations on what's highest, or conceptualizations as limited government, and the notion that each person is of divine value, and all as reflections of what should be in the highest place.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Jordan, I love what Ayaan's saying too, because I think contrast is the mother of clarity.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And leaders should define reality and set out the choices the people must make. So Moses, I put before you blessing, curse, life, and choose life. Mm-hmm. Abraham Lincoln, you can't be half slave, half free. We've got to choose. And we've got to say that to the West today. So, I mentioned in the video, I was a 7-year-old in the Chinese Revolution. When I was many, many years later, a graduate student at Oxford, I remember dinners with the great Sir Isaiah Berlin. And the first time it turned out he'd been a 7-year-old in the Russian Revolution. And he described with a shudder the things he saw, as I could well do the things I saw in Nanjing. But then he always ended up by saying, thank goodness the West stood against Hitler and Stalin. I can't imagine what he would think if he looked at cultural Marxism and its inroads today. But we've got to get people, they're tackling this, that. In America, they're playing, I call it a game of whack-a-mole. Outrage here, protest there, scandal here. people have no sense of the overall choice. And we've got to make that choice because the West is at stake and set it out. Contrast is the mother of clarity.
John?
I think the comment that I'd want to make is that the most dangerous thing you can do is to make government God in a democracy. It should be kept firmly downstream of culture, and culture is downstream really of beliefs and values. And so it is that our essential freedoms, as we've mapped them out in a sort of legislative or democratic sense, and they've been touched on this morning, are of course freedom of conscience and belief, which you see as so critical, rightly I think, of speech so that we can defend the other values, of assembly, and of my right to trade my property, including my skills. Those should be seen as vested in the individual and in my neighbour, because you're another individual, should never be selfish, not the government. But we seem to be subverting this and saying that somehow or other, oh government, please, we'll be ever so thankful if you give us some freedom. It's the wrong way around. Government's task in a democracy actually is to recognise the primacy of the individual and to support and defend their freedoms against their own interests. Now there's a novel thought, but that's the right way for it to work. And in a democracy, governments should only take upon themselves those powers which are ceded peacefully and democratically by the electors. Another way of putting it might be simply to say that take, if you like, the idea of responsibility to a higher authority away, and government becomes God. And that, I think, is something we need to avoid, because governments will always want to accumulate more and more power to themselves without principle. Yes. So we need to understand our freedoms, understand the framework in which they're attached to us, and to insist that our governments respect and defend those freedoms. And I think we've lost our clarity of thinking around that in the West to a very great degree.
Well, one of the things that struck me as a weakness of secular humanism, the secular humanists that I've talked to who are admirably capable of defending their point, they propose that we can have a society that has dispensed of its religious superstitions and yet maintain the proper moral order. But the problem I have with this, and it's related to our discussion of what has to be put in the highest place, is that our civilization is predicated on the assumption that we have a certain set of rights, let's say, and you might think of those as resting on the assumption that we're of intrinsic value, right? But if you don't hypothesize the existence of some transcendent domain in which ethics itself resides, that's a good way of thinking about it, then you're stuck with the problem of trying to understand on what do those rights rest. And if there's nothing that's outside, if there's nothing transcendent and nothing outside the state, then your rights become dependent on the state, and then it seems to me that the state de facto becomes God.
That's right. I think that's getting to the nub of the issue. The nub of the issue for the secular West is on what basis will I commit to the idea that my neighbour, particularly if I disagree with my neighbour and I don't like my neighbour and my neighbour is objectionable, has any worth at all, let alone, as our longest-serving Prime Minister in Australia, Sir Robert Menzies, put it, and he was not a particularly religious person, I don't think, but he was, like Churchill, he was a sort of civilisational Christian. He saw the importance of it. And he wrote fascinatingly that democracy is not a machine, it's a spirit in which we recognise no matter your station in Australian society, your rank, your wealth, whatever, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. The idea of a higher authority insisting that you and I matter equally, when I actually want to say you must matter much more than me, Jordan, but that's a reversal of the normal. This desire to lord it over others. On what basis? On what basis should I say the other person actually really does matter? Mm-hmm. And of course, you immediately then, with the sort of secular model, fall into the great problem that very quickly you say, well, they're moral beings, they're intelligent beings, they look like us, and before you know it, they're saying, but they're less intelligent than me, or they're stupider than me. So they're not really equal at all. And that's the basis, I think, of the rot. You've got to have somebody saying that right until the death knell, you have a genuine equality, and equality, if you like, of real opportunity.
Well, I think that's... Oh, go ahead, Oz.
We're a cut flower civilization now. The roots have been cut, and people are still relying on the flower, but flower in a vase will die. Yeah. So, put it bluntly, we're not only post-truth, we are increasingly post-rights.
Right.
And the alternative that's coming, you can see it in Hamas, is barbarism.
Well, well, one of the... This is an extension of your argument, John, and a comment on what Oz just said is, see, you said, why should I attribute to my neighbor any worth at all? And you developed that point, especially, for example, if they're less intelligent or less able, or there's some dimension of evaluation on which they're lesser. But the power proclamation also devours itself on that ground, because one of the things I think that people who put forward the proposition that power is everything can't deal with is, if I do have power over you, in what manner possibly can and should you be defended from me? Because if there's nothing but power and you are now powerless, then why don't I have the right, I certainly have the ability, why don't I have the right to just run roughshod over you? And on what grounds could you possibly object? If power is everything, then the most powerful person is everything, and the most powerful person therefore has dominion over the weakest person, and that's that. And I don't see a defense against that on the secular humanist side. And so John, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that is a huge problem, and I don't think he'd mind me saying it. I was talking about it with Tom Holland over dinner one night. It wasn't publicly recorded, but he said that is actually the greatest problem for the secular humanist view. How do you actually find a genuine basis for the respect on an equal basis of all citizens, even when you disagree with them? Now, I can't help mentioning this, the Australians will know, but the non-Australians seem to be talking about it nearly as much. We've just had a constitutional referendum in Australia. It's very difficult to change the Australian constitution. And what happened was that every elite grouping in the country, as far as I can tell, from the Prime Minister and his ministers down, through to all of the academia, 90% of the media, it was just astonishing. The corporate types, the sporting codes, saying you need to insert this modest little proposal that just happens to be a group right for one group of Australians based on their ancestry or their colour or both, depending on how you chose to pitch the argument. And what was absolutely astonishing was, despite the heft of the cultural elites, the Australian people said resoundingly, in no uncertain way, no. And the research showed that they said no overwhelmingly, because they said we do not want to be divided. And so then we hear that, the intelligent people who have degrees and a lot of money and live in the wealthy suburbs, they could see the value of this move. And so you get this terrible divide. Clever people, we elites know best for you, so they'll try and go round it.
Yeah.
So in a sense, this is a civilisational moment. Are we going to respect the voting citizens again and their clear will and intent? Because we're the arc of responsible citizens. We want to reinvigorate a citizenship where people feel alienated and patronised, because they are being alienated and patronised by the expertocracy. And we have got to believe that instinctively, particularly if they've got leadership, we can draw out the better angels in our nature, because we all have the better angels and the selfish angels, and try and ensure that democracy works again properly and we work forward on a basis of restored trust. Because nothing is more corrosive to our societies than the breakdown of trust. Trust in individuals, trust in politicians, trust in institutions. But I want to say to you, in my view, worst of all, the breakdown of trust in our driving beliefs and ideals and values. And if we can restore those, look, there'll be those who want to paint us as reactionary. I don't want to be seen as reactionary. I don't want to say we go back to creating yesterday's societies. There were things wrong with it. But I do want to say that the old verities the old truths, a proper understanding of the worth and dignity of all, held in suspension with an understanding of our failings. Realism, as opposed to utopianism, must be the basis of freedom moving on, whatever it turns out to look like in the modern age.
Ayaan, maybe I'll close with you, if you don't mind. And so you, early in your life, relatively early in your life, you moved away from a totalizing religious view of the world. And I don't exactly know into what you then moved, whether that was a secular humanism, but what I'm hearing from you now, and I believe this is also the case with your husband, is that you have come to a new understanding of the existence of the transcendent per se, and also of your relationship with it. Now, first of all, do I have that right? And second of all, like, is that the movement that you have made, and if so, why?
So I rebelled against a transcendent, a concept of God, of a God that now manifests itself in, the Iranian regime, Hamas, ISIS. That was the God I grew up with. That was the story that I grew up with. I rebelled against that. And then when I was bold enough to say, and this was in the Netherlands, I don't want any of that. I didn't convert to Christianity. I didn't convert to another religion or another God. I carried with me this idea, the three-letter word of God stands just for evil. And my best friends became Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. These are people I still love and adore. And I think over time, I'm now 53, and so when I was in this state of rebellion, it started for me when I was 32 years old. Over time, I've come to realize, and I wish Christopher was alive today to comment on what we're going through, was we were actually having a conversation about, in my view, the wrong conversation. Does God exist? It was the world built in 6 days. Do we believe in fairy tales? And that was the wrong conversation to have. The right conversation to have, as I said earlier, was to compare what we as human beings, the transcendent that we have imagined and developed over centuries. And so now I can say I am proudly of Judeo-Christian religion without having to waste your time about, do I really think that the world was built in 6 days? Do I really believe every word in the Bible? No, but I do believe that that's Judeo-Christian tradition, and what it has brought forth those are the values that I aspire to, the values by which I live. I was called a Christian by Roger Scruton in 2008, and I said, Roger, no, I'm not a Christian. And he said, but you act like a Christian, and you behave like a Christian, therefore you are a Christian. And I think that's exactly what I would like to say to Richard Dawkins. You act like, I've been to, choral music with him, which he enjoys very much. And he's one of the most Christian people I know. And so I think we've been having this time-wasting debates. And you grow up, I matured, here I am. But the quotes that you just had about Western civilization is a cut flower, and cut flowers die. That is true. Cut flowers do die. But what we have in terms of Western civilization is a lot of seed packets. And I want to send you off with these seed packets, which you find in libraries, which you find in, wise people like you, like Roger Scruton, like all these other people that I mentioned, in statues. We have the remnants, the symbols of Western heritage, and their seeds. And all we have to do, those of us who inherited it and enjoy it, is to go and seed them, grow them, nurture them, water them, and when they're attacked, fight for them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.